start with you, Nigel, but Rob, please do chip in as well. What are the key questions that we should start asking ourselves now to start getting our heads around that issue? You know, should we be expecting to welcome humanoids into our church congregations sometime very soon?
Well, it could be an improvement on some people we have there now. I don't know. I think the way to deal with new things is to work by analogy, which is part of what I do in the book. So, for example, intelligent creatures. Okay, well, whales are intelligent creatures. There are a lot of intelligent creatures out there that aren't human. I mean, there are clues here. And I like the fact Rob made a very similar point about relationships. He was talking about relationships with your house and with books, you know. I mean, we have all kinds of things that are actually more than simple owner, you know, tool maker type relationships. We have a favorite mug we like, you know, have our tea in. There's a lot going on in the way in which we respond to non-human, as well as, of course, to animals, to pets, and so on. And we think of children with toys, and we, in a sense, have our own toys that we're very fond of. And I think if we think through, I suspect most of us have never thought about that. The fact that we have a fondness for a house, or for a book, or you know, or for a mug, or for this laptop rather than the one we get at work. I think this will provide us with a sort of heuristic. The limitations, I mean, the curiosity of this fondness, where it comes from, a bit of a clue as to how we should relate to intelligent toys. And of course, I mean, the examples of, you know, Hello Barbie, you know, which is Mattel produced this talking doll for your little girls. I don't know if you have experience of Hello Barbie, you know, who was loaded up with thousands of conversations. And all sorts of discussion, interesting discussion about whether this is a good idea, whether this limits the child's imagination, quite apart from the privacy issues involved. But I think this isn't a completely fresh experience for us to be having something like a relationship with something which is a thing. And I think examining the relationships we have, existing relationships with non-persons, is going to provide us with something of a heuristic.
Am I on? I am on. Rob, could I come to you on the humanoid aspect of things from an industry perspective? How do you see developments in that kind of aspect of AI developing? I know it's quite, if I can use the term, popular in Japanese sector for developing humanoids, robots particularly with a human characteristic to them.
So I think the thing you have to remember is that Japanese culture is a little bit different to ours, and that's why we have Alexa. So we don't need the face. You know, it can still be interesting and emotional, all that sort of stuff. So there are lots of different ways in which we will interact with computers. Having a face on the front is not necessarily required. Although I wouldn't be at all surprised if we will end up with you know, really high def screens which are not faces but have all, you know, because so this goes back to the issue of laziness. So people will sell us products that are affordable, that we like using, that give us the most function. And if that means to say that you have a user interface to the computer, which is intuitive and you like it, then of course that's what we'll be invested in. So you know, industry will be driven by what we want. So it's not rocket science to work out what skin, if you like, you know, we'll put on these things. Does that make sense?
Related to the relationship issue, both of you also touched on the nature of jobs and employment. Do you think there are any jobs that robots will never, ever be able to do? Perhaps I'll come to Rob on that one from an industry perspective and how the technology is developing.
The simple answer to that question is no, because what timescale are you talking about? So in 1,000 years, you know, we are absolutely only at the dawn of a digital age. Right, in 1,000 years, it will not. It's not possible for us to conceive what will be. Right. So I was in Rome at the weekend. I was 50, and you know, you can still see what the Romans were doing, and actually very little has changed. You know, you see the sewers, and you see the buildings, and you see the schools, and etc. etc. All bets are off for the next 1,000 years. The only question is when in the next 1,000 years do things start to change. So never there's no point asking that question. It's when, and what do we do about it that's the important. So when in the next, is it 1,000 years, or is it when in the next 100 years, or when in the next 25 years? That's the question to ask.
Thank you very much for queuing that up very nicely, because I thought that might be the case. My next question then, if it's a question of when, then also we need to be thinking trade unions and what they are anticipating in terms of their workforce and work colleagues. Nigel, I know you've had some contact both in the US and the UK in terms of unions and trade unions and anticipating where things are taking us. Would you like to kind of comment on how you found their engagement and also on their perspective of how future employment, the direction of future employment could lead to, or where it's heading?
Yes, thank you. Although I will, in fact, just jump on what Rob said and say, well, 1 billion years, you know. I mean, I think anything we want to think through ethically in this context has to have that sort of time horizon. Maybe it's 1 billion years, maybe 1,000 years is at least just about within our capacity to draw our Moore's law curve. But yeah, very. I mean, I'm just intrigued by this because I reached out, as we Americans say, to AFL-CIO, which is the American equivalent of the TUC, and also to the TUC. And Matt and I were involved in a very interesting panel discussion at UCL, which BioCentre hosted with UCL, which had a TUC economist there as part of our panel. And then we had another engagement with people in the seafaring union area. And it's interesting to me that basically these people are very defensive. I mean, the TUC guy, AFL-CIO in the US, they just didn't seem to think this was a problem. And this is just innovation, it's technology. Hello? Is this different? Who knows? I mean, obviously, this is not for voice projection. This is for presumably some taping purpose. I'm holding this very large thing. I've been very surprised. I mean, I think people in the labour movement are scared of being laid.
Speaking of Luddism, I've one here I prepared already. You know, I think they're very scared of being, you know, tagged with the Luddite label. And it saddens me, because I would have thought they would be the ones producing some sort of serious critique and raising hard questions, because plainly labour markets are going to suffer enormous turbulence in the next 20-25 years. I think there's no serious opinion that would disagree with that I would respect. I think there are big differences as to how fast things will happen and precisely where they will happen. But the thing is, it isn't so much this is the fourth industrial revolution, which is Klaus Schwab's term. I don't like that we're categorizing what's going on. What we're going to see, in a sense, is a series of industrial revolutions in parallel in quite different sectors of the economy, among psychologists and counsellors, among bank clerks, among people in supermarkets, among drivers, and on and on and on. You read the Suskins book about the future of the professions. I had dinner with a lawyer in Kansas City 4 days ago, and this wasn't the topic of the event, but I mean, he was just saying how they have to hire many few associates now, middle-level lawyers in these American firms, because of the software they can now use to analyze documents. I mean, it's happening in a sense. You're going to get the sort of Rust Belt experience all over the place in the economy. And this is even assuming there will be new jobs being developed, new careers, so that you end up still with some notion of full employment. The more I talk about this, the less encouraged I am that we will see that. I think full employment is going to be over. And I think this is as big a crisis facing the industrialized economies, and perhaps even a bigger crisis in the developing economies, as the whole global warming scenario. And, God bless Jeremy Corbyn for talking about this issue. He's the first political leader in the world to make a speech and identify this as a problem. But it astonishes me that the labour movement hasn't been jumping up and down about this for years.
Rob, do you want to come back on any of that in terms of your involvement, Raz?
Not really.
Not really? Okay, that's fine. You've both mentioned, I think, certainly Elon Musk and also Stephen Hawking as well, on their comments about the development of full artificial intelligence and what that could spell for the future of the human race. Elon Musk's particularly being something seriously dangerous going to happen as a result of machines with artificial intelligence. What do you think, while celebrating the benefits and the developments that are taking place, what should be our kind of key concerns for where things are heading? Or are there really no substance to the fears, that it's all good and we've just got to be wise and act wisely in terms of seeing this technology develop?
So I do think that we should support anything which raises the debate about autonomous weapon systems. That's an obvious one, although there are real problems with that, because of course a Tomahawk missile is autonomous, so it's not easy at all. But we should be worried about war. War is a very human thing. So that's one thing we should be talking about a lot.
Yeah, I'll endorse that. I was very struck by a quote from a French colonel being interviewed on television back when we were bombing Serbia, for those of you who recall those days. And the Americans were bombing Serbia from 30,000 feet or something like that, because they couldn't afford to take one casualty, or politically it would all have been over for the US position. And this meant there was a lot of collateral damage. And because the French took a lot of casualties during the Balkan Wars. And I was so impressed with what this man said. He said, a cause that is worth killing for has to be worth dying for. And the problem with our move increasingly into autonomous systems is that we make a fundamental bifurcation there. And I think that's a matter of great... I mean, more broadly, I think there are three stages I see here. I mean, currently, because we have functionality, I mean, goodness gracious me, you can wake up at 3 in the morning, you can't go back to sleep, you pull out your mobile phone and you plan your next 2 air trips. So it isn't just a wonderful thing. You can just do all this thing, takes you 15 minutes, and you've achieved something, and you go back to sleep. And you do it all on your back and your bed with your phone. At least I do that. Now, and because of these very complex AI systems which are in place. Then you get the issue of leverage and power, and the fact that Zuckerberg and Schmidt now have enormous power over our lives. And we aren't even aware of it because we don't pay them any money. We just have this fuzzy barter arrangement, which I think ultimately will probably be made illegal. I mean, barter is a very bad thing in any economy. And barter is driving the 2 most important companies in the world. And nobody seems to be bothered about this in government circles. But I think leverage, as companies increasingly have power using data and using algorithms over the rest of us. Thirdly, of course, then you have the spectre which Musk raised of the demon. Are we raising the demon, he said. Actually picking up a phrase from the robot play, CapEx play from the 1920s. And I think the notion that the systems actually run out of control, even of Zuckerberg and Schmidt, and do stuff. And of course, there's an argument that one of the causes of the collapse, the Wall Street collapse, was precisely this. It was an early example of this because, I mean, the derivatives, the multi-layered derivatives, which power much of the financial markets, no one understands them because they're just too complicated, and the algorithms understand them, and by and large they keep things under control. And there've been more than one case where that has really got out of control. So this is not just a totally future-oriented discussion.
I think we have to... What was the question? I can't remember. But anyway, this is the answer to the question I can't remember. I think we have to work out what we value. That moment I mentioned over that dinner where we were talking about robots and sex and all that sort of stuff. It was really interesting what human behaviour emerged. And I do think you can really only value something if it is somehow scarce. I think this is one of the things with software and computers and the like. So when it breaks, you just go and get another one and you download the software again. So you start again. So you can just transfer. There's something in that space which I think is really quite profound. So it's about mortality or scarcity. I've got a shake of the head, which is interesting. So I'm not one of those people who believes that you can. Well, I suspect we probably will download our brains to computers at some point, but I think scarcity is important.
Okay. Conscious of time, but we've got this afternoon as well to continue these discussions. We've kind of painted in fairly kind of broad brush strokes in terms of our discussion now, but also in the presentations that we've heard. I'm conscious, though, many here are church leaders. They'll be leading congregations who may well be actively involved in social action programs, debt counselling, street pastors, helping the homeless, overseas involvement, the list goes on. How does this robot revolution fit with this? There's many things that you've both shared that we can understand, we can grasp, we can see the importance of, but how does this begin to start taking traction in a local church or the church congregational level? How should the church be engaging, do you think?
Well, I gather there's a panel on this afternoon, which I'll be listening to with interest. It seems to me, from one point of view, there's a possibility of extraordinary prosperity awaiting us. And I think it isn't entirely clear, but I think it is. There's a sporting chance, if one can use that term in a theological context, of extraordinary prosperity. And if that prosperity comes, then we will have the means to distribute it, if the policy framework is sane. I think there's also the possibility of an increasingly bimodal income distribution, and particularly wealth distribution, in which we have enormous poverty and we have enormously wealthy companies and individuals. And if you've read Piketty, and there are all sorts of discussions going on among economists about how that's playing out. I think in practical terms, I think so. I mean, in terms of the church having social programs, I mean, engaged with the needy, I think there are incredible opportunities there. On the other hand, I think there's also a possibility of great laziness because, I mean, the whole point about these machines is they're doing stuff that we do. So maybe you can just, we already have these robot policemen in Dubai. Maybe you can just, on your street sort of work can be done by machines. You can send them out there and they'll do the counselling and they'll hand out the food and so on and so forth. And you can sit back. On the other hand, you're going to have an awful lot of people with not much to do with themselves in your churches, I think. And the opportunity here for the churches to provide a frame of reference for the post-work economy is going to be really interesting. But I'm not quite sure who is doing the thinking about that among the church's leaders today.
Isn't it lunchtime?
Very shortly.
Gosh, I mean, these just, who knows? It's the simple question.
As somebody that's engaged with, say, a government level as well, would you say that there is certainly a place for the church to engage, or is this something just a passing fad which is just going to kind of blow out, and really we should be thinking of other things?
What do you mean artificial intelligence is a passing
robotics,
fad? It's not a passing fad.
Right.
It's here, and it's only going to get better. So so we have to work out what our USP is.
Which is partly what my final question to you both was: what key point would you like to have everyone here leave this event today ringing in their ears, at the back of their minds? What key point would you like to make? And I think that's a very salient point, Rob. Thank you. Nigel, anything to add to that?
Well, I think the way I finished this little book with the pictures is that let's embrace the technology. Let's thank God for it. But let's work for a human future in which humans are at the centre of things. And I think if that can't be the message that the church can come up with, then it's not going to be anybody else bothering with it. And I think part of our problem in the church is because we think this spiritual thing somehow is the counterweight to the human thing, and to talk about, humanism has become hijacked by agnostics. Humanism is a profoundly Christian vision of the world in which the human questions are the central questions. And I think it might seem an odd thing, but the church needs to come out as the world's leading pro-human organization. And I think that is a way in which we can be faithful to God.